I'll tell you right now that I did not go to the depot expecting a miracle. I went expecting a woman who could cook, who wouldn't ask too many questions, and who understood that a cattle ranch in the dry Willow Flats was not a parlor in Cincinnati. I had written that plainly in the letter. I had said, the work is hard, the house is rough, the winters are long, and I am not a man of many words. I thought that was fair warning. I thought the woman who answered it would be someone who had already run out of better options and was prepared to make do. I was half an hour late to the depot. My mare had thrown a shoe at the creek crossing, and I'd walked her in slow rather than lame her, which meant I arrived at the platform dusty and irritated with my hat in my hand and my shirt not entirely clean. There was a woman standing with a single trunk, looking at the surrounding country the way a person looks at a horse they've been told is gentle and aren't yet convinced. She was not young, I'd put her at 30 or close to it, and she was not what I'd call soft. Square in the shoulder. Brown hair pinned back the way a woman pins her hair when she means to get things done and not fuss about it afterward. She had a schoolteacher's posture and a schoolteacher's eyes, which I learned later was not coincidence, because she had been one for 7 years outside of Columbus, Ohio, until the schoolhouse district was cut and she was left with a trunk of books and a very practical mind about her circumstances. I said, and I am not proud of this as a first thing to say to a woman, you must be the bride. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, and you must be late. I put her trunk in the wagon and drove us 12 miles back to Colburn Ranch without what you'd call a conversation. She looked out at the range. I watched the road. At the end of it I carried her trunk to the room I'd cleared off my old foreman's gear, and I said dinner was whatever she found in the pantry, because I had to get back to the south pasture before dark. She said, is that how it works here? I said, that is how it works here. She nodded, as if she were filing that away for consideration. I rode out. The next morning there was coffee at 5 o'clock. Strong coffee, the kind that does what it's supposed to do. The morning after that there was bacon and cornbread, and the kitchen had been reorganized so thoroughly that I spent 2 days finding where the tin cups had gone. I said nothing about the cups. I found them eventually. They were where they made more sense. What I did not expect, what I had not put in the letter, because I had not thought it would matter, was that she would ask questions. Not prying questions. Not personal ones, at first. She asked about the pasture rotation. She asked why I'd built the lean-to on the north side of the barn rather than the south. She asked what I'd done with the back 40 before the drought took the grass. I answered her because the questions were sensible and a man who won't answer a sensible question is a fool, but I did it short, and I made sure she understood by the shortness of it that I wasn't inviting more. She didn't seem to notice. Or she noticed and ignored it, which amounts to the same thing. By the end of the second week she had repaired the hinge on the root cellar door, which had been sticking since April, using nothing but a piece of tack leather and a nail she found in the barn. I had walked past that hinge 40 times and not fixed it. I'm not saying that to flatter her. I'm saying it because it's the kind of thing a man notices when he's trying very hard not to notice anything. She read in the evenings. She'd brought books in that trunk, more books than a single trunk ought to hold. I don't know how she managed the weight, and after dinner she'd sit by the lamp with one of them, and there was something in it that settled the house. It had been a quiet house since my first wife Clara passed, 4 years prior. A different kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that sits in the corners and doesn't move. This was a different thing. This was a quiet that was occupied. I am not sure I can explain the difference better than that. I started coming in from the range a little before full dark instead of after. I told myself it was because the light was getting shorter in October and it made no sense to be out past what you could see. That was true. That was not the whole truth. She was always at the table or the lamp or the window when I came in. There were 3 or 4 evenings where I rode up in the last of the light and I could see her through the glass, just her profile, the lamp behind her, the way she had of resting one hand on the sill while she looked out across the flats. I do not know if she was looking for anything in particular. I do not know if she knew I could see her. I know that I came around the corner of the barn a little slower than I needed to, those evenings. I know that. We had our arguments. She thought I was being short-sighted about the winter feed stores, and she was right, which made it worse. I thought she was spending too much of her own small savings on lamp oil when we had perfectly good tallow, and I was being a miser, which she told me plainly without raising her voice. We did not sulk. Neither of us was built for it. We disagreed, said our piece, and went back to the work, and I found that I preferred that to most other ways a household can operate. She asked me once, in early October, about Clara. We were mending fence on the east line, something she'd offered to help with and I hadn't refused, because the fence needed doing and I had more posts than hands. She'd tied her skirt back out of the mud and worked the wire without complaint, and I'd stopped being surprised by that. She asked quietly, without making a moment of it, the way she asked most things. I told her a little. Clara had been a good woman, and she died of a fever in February, and the house had been emptier since. Edna, that was her name, Edna Price, and she'd told me the first day, though I'd been slow to use it. Edna listened without saying she was sorry or that things happen for reasons, which is what most people say and which means very little. She just said, she must have kept a good house. And I said yes, she had. And we went back to the fence. I didn't know what to do with that. I sat with it for a few days and decided I didn't need to do anything with it. It was just a true thing she'd said, and she was a woman who said true things. That was becoming apparent. There is a kind of honesty that doesn't announce itself and doesn't expect applause. She had it. I had spent 4 years in a house where that quality was absent, not from any fault, just from absence, and I had forgotten what it felt like to have it near. The storm came in the 3rd week of October. I saw it coming by midday, the sky doing what this range does when it means business, going gray-yellow in the northwest and then purple, the wind starting up low and dirty. I had cattle on the north ridge that needed bringing down, and I rode up with the idea of having it done in 2 hours. I did not have it done in 2 hours. The sky moved faster than I did, and by 4 o'clock it was blowing hard and raining sideways and I could not see the bottom trail clearly enough to bring the cattle down without losing one over the drop. So I made the decision a rancher sometimes has to make. I hobbled the horse in the lee of the ridge rock, wrapped up in my slicker, and I waited. It was a long night. Cold. The kind of cold that gets in through the leather and sits against your ribs and doesn't leave even when you shift against the rock trying to find a dry inch. I watched the lightning work along the ridge and I thought about the cattle. I thought about whether the north pasture gate would hold, because I hadn't reinforced the latch the way I'd meant to and it had been nagging at me since September. I thought about the root cellar runoff channel. A man on a long cold ridge thinks about everything he meant to fix and didn't. And I thought, and I did not examine this too hard, not that night in the rain, about the lamp in the kitchen window, and whether it was lit, and whether she had gone to bed or was waiting. I came down at first light when the rain had gone to drizzle and the trail was passable. The cattle were all accounted for. I was soaked through and my hands were clumsy with the cold and I had not slept, and I rode into the yard and put my horse up and came to the back door expecting nothing more than to get dry. The lamp was on. The stove was going. There was coffee in the pot and it was hot, which meant she'd been up watching for me. She was standing at the window when I came in, standing just the way I'd seen her in the evenings, one hand on the sill. She turned when the door opened. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they'd been worried about and were relieved to find intact. She didn't say she'd been worried. She said, "Sit down. There's coffee and I've got eggs." I sat down. She poured the coffee and set a plate in front of me and sat down across the table with her own cup and her hands around it, and we were quiet for a little while in the way that had become familiar to me. The good kind of quiet. The occupied kind. I looked at the lamp still burning on the sill. I looked at her. And I knew, it was one of those knowings that comes all the way arrived, not in pieces, that I had been riding back to this. Not just to the ranch. Not to the cattle or the fence or the work. To the lamp in the window and the woman who'd kept it burning. I said, "I need to say something." She looked up. "I wrote that letter thinking I needed a cook," I said. "And a woman who'd take the work without asking too much. I wrote it practical, because I am a practical man and that was the honest account of the situation." I stopped. I am not a man who makes speeches. "The situation has changed," I said. "Or, my understanding of it has changed. I would like you to stay. Not in the way we arranged. In the real way." I picked up the coffee cup because I didn't know what to do with my hands. I'm not a man who does things gracefully. You've had ample evidence of that. But I would rather be ungraceful about this than not say it at all. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp held. The stove knocked the way a good stove does in the cold. I have been standing at that window every evening, she said, since the second week. Watching for your horse. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, without apology or decoration. I was going to tell myself it was because dinner was ready and I needed to know when to put it on. But that wore thin as an excuse. I said, it's not much of an excuse. No, she said. It's not. And she smiled, not the polite smile she'd used that first day at the depot, but the other one, the one she gave when something struck her as genuinely worth smiling at, which was rarer and better. I'll stay, Rafe. In the real way. We were married in November, in town, with the Dunbar brothers as witnesses because they were the only neighbors who could be gotten to on short notice. Edna wore the same brown dress she'd worn to the depot. I wore my good hat. The preacher was brief, which I appreciated. She still stands at the window in the evenings. Old habit by now, or maybe not a habit at all but a choice, the kind of choice a person makes without examining it because it already knows its own answer. And I still come in off the range with the last light, around the corner of the barn a little slower than I need to, and I look up at the window, and there she is. It is not a grand thing. It is a very small thing, when you look at it plain. A woman at a window. A man on a horse coming home. But I have ridden this range for 20 years and I know the difference between a place you return to and a place you come home to. This is the latter. She is the reason. That is the whole of it, and it is enough.